Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker this morning. Andrew Reiner teaches in the Honors College and English Department at Towson University, where he offers a seminar, Real Men Smile, The Changing Face of Masculinity. His writing about masculinity and men's issues has appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post magazine. One New York Times piece was selected as one of the 10 best in 2016 for the Well Family column, and another about the need to teach boys and men greater emotional honesty gained traction with more than 1.4 million readers internationally. National Public Radio, Canadian Broadcasting Company, The Guardian, Men's Health Magazine, and Forbes have interviewed Mr. Reiner and relied on his expertise in topics related to masculine identity. Earlier this month, Mr. Reiner sat down with a group of boys Latin faculty to discuss risk-taking in the classroom. The discussion was a part of his research for the book he is writing on masculinity that explores some of the themes he will share with our community of boys educators. Mr. Reiner is driving the discussion on masculinity, and we could not be more happy to welcome him here this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Reiner.
Good morning, everyone. Well, it's a pleasure and honor to be with you all here this morning. Before I begin, I want to thank Robin Smith for all of her hard work and her late 3 a.m. emails back to me. Much appreciated. I'm sure you needed much deserved rest. I also want to thank Christopher Post for bringing me to speak with you today, and also for his curiosity about a topic that's ahead of the curve for a lot of American schools. It's a topic that a lot of Australian, New Zealander, and the British schools, they get it in terms of what boys need as learners, and I think more importantly as humans. And that topic is central to what I want to talk about today. The topic is this: how we talk to and about boys, both in and out of school, and how these words often perpetuate a masculine identity that isn't serving them either in or out of school. I first became aware of the ways that we perpetuate a limiting language for boys when my now 5-year-old son, Makala, was born. I was excited to read to him. I knew about the studies which found that reading has profound ripple effects on a child's educational success. And I had taught middle school long enough to know how much many boys dislike reading fiction. More than anything, though, I think, I was looking forward to exposing Makala to stories about men and fathers who modeled nurturing sensitivity for them, for boys. A funny thing happened on my way to this engineered gender bending. Books that my wife and I read to him always had mothers present, but not always fathers. If the fathers were present, both physically and emotionally, they weren't like the mothers, who were nurturing, compassionate, and sensitive to the emotional needs of the young sons who are the characters. The fathers were more like buddies or pals. They took their sons on adventures. They angled for laughs through funny or goofy things. They modeled cool behavior. They modeled physical strength. None of these things in and of themselves are bad, of course. But here's what these dads didn't do. They didn't anticipate the deeper emotional needs of the young male characters as much as they modeled ways to develop self-control and dominion over them, like the fathers in such stories as Little Bear and Owl Moon. This, by the way, is one of the dreadful responsibilities of being a writer. You have to take aim at the things and the people that you hold most dear. I love both of those books. Now, self-control, obviously, it's a wonderful thing. Lord knows more boys in this day and age could use it. But if teaching boys about self-control concomitantly means teaching them to suppress their emotions, well, that's a different story. That perpetuates the limiting story that men, and in turn fathers, are supposed to leave the heavy lifting of deep dive emotional intelligence always to women. There were exceptions, of course, like the older male rabbit in Guess How Much I Love You. But if you wade through most children's books, you'll see this emotionally absent motif at work. When Makala was 3, my family and I moved to a small mountain in Frederick County, which is about an hour and a half from here. It's gorgeous where we live, an idyllic spot for raising kids. What wasn't so postcard perfect, though, were the public schools. Luckily, we found a decent small private schools that my in-laws, thank God, could afford. He's here, by the way, so thank you. It's situated on an old dairy farm that dates back to the early 19th century. In addition to the setting, replete with a renovated carpeted silo and pond where students catch tadpoles, we savored the arts-integrated curriculum. An arts-integrated curriculum in this age of standardized testing, can you believe it? The children couldn't learn a number or a letter in the alphabet without breaking into song. This would surely be the bastion of emotional intelligence I'd been looking for. So I was excited for the annual Father's Day breakfast. It would surely affirm the healthy gender identity messages of an arts-based curriculum. I'd heard that the children began the celebration with songs about fathers. So I was excited when we all sat down in a circle, kids in our laps, and began. Now, let me just say, if you haven't heard 20 or 30 4- and 5-year-olds sing in unison, or their own version of unison, you need to. This is more tranquilizing, more uplifting than wine or Xanax, without the hazy hangover. I closed my eyes to take it all in like a Bach concerto or the ocean waves. If my bliss was dampened a bit by the first song about dads who hammer nails all day long, it was drenched by the next song, which had the 6-year-olds crooning the refrain, "Oh, my dad is big and strong." This was one of those moments that we sometimes have when you feel as if you're looking at everyone else from a remove, or that you're in a bubble, and you're wondering, is this just me? Is anyone else here just a little bit bothered by this? To many, probably most people, this may sound like I'm making a big deal over something small, something really trivial. I get that. After all, we're talking about a kid's song with a harmless enough message, right? But please consider this. What if those children sang a song about how their mothers were great at staying home all day long and making meatloaf and doing the laundry and cleaning up the home? A lot of us, including men, would have a problem with that. Such characterizations of women sound cartoonish today, and they should. So why don't such characterizations of men sound equally farcical? That's not a rhetorical question, by the way. Yet I don't see anyone concerned about this, about how we speak and sing to boys, about what it means to be a man. And really, it should. Researchers who published a 2014 study in an online edition of Pediatrics found that fathers respond to babies' vocalization, either cooing, babbling, or their heart-rending cries, only 27 to 30% of the time, compared with mothers who responded as much as 94% of the time. This doesn't come as a surprise. We're talking about dads who sneak off to their man caves, after all. But here's the problem with their forms of physical and emotional absence. Fathers, it turns out, are more important to their children's language development than even their mothers are. According to another study, fathers made unique contributions to children's expressive language development that went above and beyond the contributions of education and childcare. When fathers used more words and with their children during play, children had more advanced language skills only a year later. The implication is that fathers may be making important contributions to their children's success later in school through simply talking with them. What's more, a 2017 study led by Emory University researchers discovered, among other things, that fathers also sing and smile more to their daughters, and they use language that is more analytical and that acknowledges their sadness far more than they do with their sons. The words they use with their sons are more focused on achievement, words like top, win, proud. Researchers believe that these discrepancies in fathers' language may contribute to the consistent findings that girls outperform boys in school. This may come as a surprise, but mothers follow the same script as fathers. That 2014 pediatric study that I mentioned found that mothers interacted vocally more often with infant daughters, than they do their infant sons. Another study published in the British Journal of Developmental Psychology took this research a step further. Researchers found that mothers were more likely to use emotional words and emotional topics when speaking with their 4-year-old daughters than they did with their 4-year-old sons. They were particularly expressive with their daughters, who were more likely than sons to speak about emotions with their fathers when talking about past experiences. During these reminiscing conversations, fathers used more emotionally laden words with their 4-year-old daughters than they did with their 4-year-old sons. As if all of this wasn't enough to give pause, there's this. Girls, it turns out, don't corner the market on emotional intelligence early on. At 4 years old, boys and girls, research shows, are equally astute at reading emotions in people and in situations. This bears repeating. At 4 years old, boys and girls are equally astute at reading emotions in people and in situations. So the language of emotional intelligence that we largely reserve for girls sends a subtle but powerful, long-lasting message. Feelings aren't only the domain of girls. Something about that vocabulary, though, is off-limit to boys. If you're wondering how it's possible that boys could possibly keep step with girls when it comes to emotional intelligence, there's a well-guarded secret that holds the answer to this question. Boys are born more sensitive than girls. In work that spanned 4 decades, exploring the interactions between mothers and their infants, developmental psychologist Edward Tronick made some startling discoveries about infant boys when they interact with their mothers. The researcher in the Department of Newborn Medicine at Harvard Medical School and his team discovered that boys are actually born with less ability to self-regulate their emotions than are girls. This is why, Tronick wrote in his studies, there's a greater coordination of the interaction between mothers and sons than there is between mothers and daughters. Mothers often muster greater vigilance with their infant sons, he wrote, because they're implicitly aware that their sons need more scaffolding for emotional regulation than do their daughters. That is, many mothers innately recognize that their infant sons show greater emotional sensitivity than do their daughters. Tronick's team at Harvard Medical School and Boston's Children's Hospital found that 6-month-old boys were more likely to show facial expressions of anger, to fuss, to gesture to be picked up, and they tended to cry more than the girls. Boys were also more likely to look at their mothers with facial displays and expressions of joy. If the connection between infant boys and their caregiver was broken, the boys tried to engage the caregiver. And this was when Tronick and his team discovered something startling. Some mothers wouldn't respond to their infant sons' entreaties for help. And when this happened, the infants pulled back. first physically and then emotionally. This is when many boys first learn to withdraw emotionally. In an email, Tronick summed it up this way: the manning up of infant boys begins long before language ever plays a role. It's difficult to observe this deep dissonance in most young boys because they're too young to articulate, let alone understand, the conflicting feelings they have about what they're supposed to do with their feelings. I want to show you now a short video clip that's pretty rare because it captures a boy in the throes of this conflicted struggle.
Big boy, don't cry. You got it. Don't cry. Don't cry. Again. Big boy. High five. High five. Say you a man. I'm a man. Say I'm sorry. Don't laugh at you. It's okay. It's okay. High five. It's okay. Good job. Okay. Come down. Come down. You gotta say, I'm a man. You can't trust me. I'm a man.
Is it possible to play that one more time? If we can watch that one more time, what I'd like you to pay close attention to is the very end, how things shift inside that little boy so dramatically.
Big boy, don't cry. You got it. Don't cry. Don't cry. Again. Big boy. High five. High five.
This is the part.
I'm a man. Say it. I'm sorry. Don't laugh at you. It's okay. It's okay. High five. It's okay. Good job. Okay. Come down. Come down. You gotta say, I'm a man. You can't trust me. I'm a man. High five. I'm gonna count myself in crowd, okay?
I think we can all agree. This is a loving father who's trying to help his son through a clearly painful experience the best way he knows how. This father isn't doing anything wrong here. Let's make that clear. The wording may be different from what some of us might say, but he's sending his son the same message that many of us send our boys when they're faced with fear or suffering. Trust in the trappings of your traditional gender identity to give you strength. The charge to be a man signals to this boy, really to all men and all boys, to stifle fear, pain, and suffering. It's a Pavlovian expectation. Every time the words be a man or man up ring in the ears of boys and men, there's the hope that they'll stifle back their emotions, other than anger if they want to fit in. On this little boy's screwed up face, we see the earliest stirrings of a masculine identity at war with itself, wanting to feel a normal range of emotions, but trying to please his father by replacing them with anger, the cornerstone of real man identity. It's difficult to know that as parents we contributed to this limiting identity that we instill in our boys. But it really doesn't end there. As a lot of you know, this continues in school as well. You may have heard about the many studies which found that boys do as well as girls on standardized tests, especially when it comes to math. But the grades in all subjects, including math, often fall short of girls. One study, which focused on elementary school students, found that boys of all races who perform better or equally than girls on reading or math and science received lower grades because of classroom behavior. Boys whose behavior fell in line with that of the girls received comparable grades to them. I need you to forgive me for spitballing out loud here, but when it comes to this achievement chasm, I have mixed feelings. I don't think it's unreasonable or unfair to require boys to have the same self and impulse control and focus as girls do in the classroom. Research on mindfulness programs, for instance, shows that among other things, they help students with this exact skill set. Besides, such skills would obviously help boys for the rest of their lives. Then there's the deeper, underlying issue of something else that underpinned much of boys' academic woes: the traditional masculine identity that we often help perpetuate. More on that to come. On the other hand, I can't help but feel that if a teacher creates a classroom environment that only plays to girls' natural strengths and isn't helping boys learn the skills required to self-monitor themselves, this can be a repudiation of boys' voices. This narrow identity sends the message that boys can't express themselves in ways that don't align with the limiting expectations of some teachers. In a culture that teaches to the test, we don't make enough room for boys' questions or their flights of nonlinear thinking. At the end of the day, and after sifting through these myriad complexities, I'm always left with questions. I often come back to this one. Are classrooms that play to boys will be boys sensibilities really the answer in a global world where the toolbox requires, among other things, strong communication skills, empathy, and emotional intelligence? Since the 1990s, many pundits have argued that, yes, this is still the answer. We need to stop feminizing classrooms, they maintain, because male brains excel at spatial reasoning and logic, while female brains are language-based and therefore more drawn to emotional reasoning. But a growing body of research questions this men are from Mars, women are from Venus logic. In their neural-centric books about gender, researchers Lisa Elliott and Cordelia Fine argue that the structural differences between the male and female brains are far less dramatic than we had thought. The differences in both gender learning styles, they maintain, are culturally embedded. This squares with another question I've had for a long time. Isn't it possible, maybe even probable, that traditional male norms are as pre-programmed inside of neuroscience researchers, especially men, as they are inside the rest of us? If so, wouldn't it make sense that they can't help but see unwittingly through the same lens? This growing body of research isn't limited to neuroscience, of course, or neuropsychology. In her book, Teaching Boys Who Struggle in School, educator Kathleen Palmer Cleveland shares how, before she started teaching, I had never given much thought to how boys are affected by society's restrictive set of rules regarding acceptable masculine behavior. She adds that once she had this realization, she was disturbed by the extent to which I and many other educators tacitly accepted these rules and how little effort we spent discounting or diminishing them. The result, she says, is an entrenched and socially codified force that works against boys' academic achievement. I call this socially codified force the script. I call it this because boys are handed this dog-eared narrative at a young age and are taught, often forced, to play the same part as every other guy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, No weekends or holidays off. Here are the script's most crucial plot lines. Always be in control. Off the field or off the court, never let him see you sweat. Never show that you care too much. Be a man of quick, decisive action. Better to be impulsive and wrong. Be a big deal. Be the center of attention. Never back down. Don't admit to being wrong. Never, ever appear weak, read vulnerable in any way. And of course, that means asking for help. And any deviation from this script opens you to the biggest offense of all, appearing feminine. This script is the reason for boys' chronic lack of academic success, I believe. In his book, Manhood in America, men's studies guru Michael Kimmel argues that it's the ideology of traditional masculinity that keeps boys from wanting to succeed. Boys see academic success itself as a disconfirmation of their own masculinity. So the way for many boys to keep their man cards in good standing is to dial back their academic effort and interest. One of my male students in the Honors College affirmed this when I asked students in a masculinity course I teach, why guys so rarely ask questions during class or ever sought help with their papers. In the 11 years I've taught at the college level, I have literally had 4 or 5 young men ask for help, especially with their papers. Not so the young women. They approach me after class and come during office hours. Well, of course girls come and ask for help, this male student said. They're tryhards. That's the worst thing that a guy can be in school. This is especially true for guys when it comes to the English classroom. In a 2015 paper that explores the causal relationship between normative masculine identity and low academic achievement among high school boys, researchers from Ohio State University found that gender identity plays a large role in boys' performance, especially in English. Math is perceived by boys as a subject in which they can maintain, sometimes even enhance, their social standing with other guys. Not so English. Excelling in English, these researchers observed, may weaken a boy's masculine standing. Why? Because the study finds, and as many of us already know, reading and writing are perceived by them as quintessentially effeminate skills. They're girly, they're faggy, and those are using the nice words. And guys maintain their status by constantly distancing themselves, always from the feminine. This is why nonfiction reading and writing typically passes muster with boys. As any woman who has ever argued with her boyfriend, her partner, or her husband knows, too often we men find safety in the facts. But literary fiction and poetry, especially when it's written by women, these are mediums to fear. They're the language of emotional exposure, vulnerability, empathy, all signs of purported feminine weakness, the very thing our gender expectations have always taught them to avoid at best and to suppress at worst. There's something even more critical at stake than academic fallout when we raise boys to fear and swallow back the language of emotional honesty. The psychologist Ronald Levant calls this muting normative male alexithymia. Glad I got that out correct, which means without words for emotions to describe this phenomenon. This is not some rare disease. It's a common occurrence amongst many males. They cannot name, let alone voice, their feelings of sadness, of isolation, of grief, and of course, suffering. Most of these feelings get masked beneath what else? Anger. And when humans, regardless of gender, start to feel emotionally isolated, they become physically isolated. John is a good example of this. The 42-year-old IT executive loves his wife and 2 children dearly, and yet he's clinging to a marriage that's nearly sunk. As he told me when I interviewed him for some research on my book, his wife is at the end of her rope. She's tired of, hurt from years of being in a relationship with someone who leans in on facts when they discuss their relationship. He told me, when I hurt my wife, she'll say, "Where are my feelings in there?" He wants to meet her where she is. He just simply doesn't know how. As he explained, every logical part of me wants to assuage and comfort her, even apologize to her. Yet time after time, I end up defending myself, telling her the facts of what happened. At one point in the conversation, John said, the crazy thing is that my mind is telling me exactly what she wants when she shares her pain or her frustration with me. But deep down, it feels like weakness just to admit my faults and to apologize, or even to explain to her that something that sounded insensitive wasn't even what I meant. Now, this may sound like a small epiphany for some of us, but for someone like John, who is slowly unlocking the release valve on his deeper feelings beyond anger and facts, this is significant. It's almost is as significant and profound as what he said next. Over the last several months, I've been chasing after ways to save my marriage. And now I'm realizing I'm trying to chase a relationship that I'm not even ready to be chasing. John is many boys fast-forwarded 25 and 30 years. He's superficially connected to his wife, to coworkers, to friends, and even by his own admission, to his children. Worst of all, for most of his life, he's been disconnected from himself. And this, I believe, is an integral factor in the public health crisis facing many men in America, parts of Western Europe, and Australia. Perhaps the biggest contributor to this, the engine powering the mental illness we see in so many men today, is depression. As is the case with young women, we know that more men of all ages are depressed today. The difference with men, though, is that they won't talk about it or seek help. Because as we know from the script, that would indicate weakness. A man can't go it alone or keep his mouth shut about his feelings. That's a man who seeks help. Instead, depressed males commit suicide 3.5 and 4 times more often than do females. And unlike girls, they embrace risk-taking behavior with sometimes devastating results. Last semester, an exceptionally hardworking, conscientious student, Corinne, came to my office a few hours before class. She was visibly upset and asked if she could skip class that evening. She told me it was the anniversary of a dear friend's death. His name was Jordan, she told me, and he died in a car accident 2 years ago. I'm not one for prying into anybody's personal affairs, but if someone seems like she wants to talk or to vent, I try to crack open that window. And Corinne lifted it a bit higher. He was my first kiss, she told me, in 7th grade. She told me how Jordan had had a pretty bad home life, yet despite all of that, he absolutely idolized his father. So when his father kicked Jordan out of his home after high school, Jordan was devastated. But you wouldn't have known it, Corinne said. He downplayed it perfectly. Wouldn't talk about it like it wasn't anything that he couldn't handle. But I knew better, she told me. I knew how much he always looked up to his father. I couldn't put all the pieces of the story together, but Corinne made it clear that Jordan had a hardened exterior, but was a teddy bear of a guy to her. A common archetype we hear about a lot of men. She felt the need to talk about Jordan and told me that he would never discuss his problems, that he always had everything under control. Yet she never saw him where he wasn't high or didn't have a few drinks under his belt. And when he was killed, she said, he was texting, and he was very drunk. What struck me about Jordan, from the way that Corinne described him, was how familiar he sounded. I have known, have met, have heard about countless men who fit this description. Men who wear a salty crust of unflappable confidence and competence on the outside, yet who number away their depression and their insecurities on the inside. These are men who lack the voice for processing and discussing their fears and suffering. Even if they have the words, too often they don't do anything with them because they would rather prove to themselves that they don't need any help with their problems. They would rather suffer in muted paralysis and accept those consequences. Slowly, very slowly, as a society, we're connecting the dots between the ways that depression and men's muted silence affect their mental health. But one important dot is still left unconnected. Recently, I had a piece on the topic of this talk in the New York Times. And in the wind-up of the article, I wanted to make the connection between the suicide, opiate addiction, and mass shooting epidemics plaguing men, and the rest of us, too, in our culture. The editor wouldn't allow me to bring these toxic trends up because I couldn't find a study that directly linked how emotionally tongue-tied men how emotionally tongue-tied young men are and these public health problems. I completely respect her and the publication's stance on this, but sometimes in life, you know something that studies haven't yet shown. You see it with crystalline clarity. And as I stand here before you, I will bet what meager reputation I have on this one thing. So much of what is causing men in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, and their 50s to implode has everything to do with the pipeline to their emotions that was shut off when too many of them were infants, toddlers, or even 14-year-old boys. I saw it in my father. I see it in my brothers. I see it and hear it in varying degrees amongst every single man and boy I've pretty much ever taught and known. If you're a man in this audience, I think you know what I'm talking about. And I see it in the hollow, detached gazes of the young mass killers staring back at me from news feeds. These are men whose hurt and sadness and their frustration and their suffering burst their pipes with a force that they just couldn't handle alone. So they purge themselves of these feelings, that smack of the feminine, the only way they know how. By pulling out the big guns, literally, with an immediate, seemingly undeniable way of reclaiming their masculinity, by giving voice to their suffering and imposing suffering on others that will make headlines with a big splash. So what's the solution? I think psychologist, educator, and gender-based researcher Abigail Norfleet James was right when she told me, I always tell educators, your job teaching boys is to give them an emotional vocabulary because the world takes it away from them. Now, I'm not so ignorant or naive as to think that most educators, male or female, would embrace this notion readily or easily. After all, ours is a culture that considers any display of emotional honesty as a sign of vulnerability. And we dismiss vulnerability outright as weakness, not as the strength and the show of courage that it requires. The most common way in many classrooms that we try to get boys talking, specifically about emotional honesty, is typically in small advisor-led groups during weekly non-academic periods. The only drawback with this, to the boys' minds, is that it's too contrived, too much of a sanctioned setup for what they consider girl talk. Actually, there is one more drawback. If we're really honest about it, some of us might even confess that we're as uncomfortable with this dynamic as the boys are. But here's the thing. If you're the kind of person who buys into that vulnerability is weakness mindset, then yes, pretty much anything you're asked to do that requires emotional honesty is probably going to feel pretty wretched. But if you get anything from this talk today, I hope it's this. Boys can't afford to go through life anymore with their pipelines shut. And many parents don't know what you and I do about the voice we deprive of so many boys. They don't know about the toxic fallout from it either. So what are we going to do about it? Perhaps we should think even smaller, a little bit more micro, so that boys don't feel like we're mandating emotional literacy. Maybe we can start by something as simple as encouraging questions from boys more than we do answers. This would subtly discourage alpha dominance and might flip around the adage that boys like to prove while girls like to improve. Plus, it would encourage a crucial skill that's often absent from boys who disconnect from masculine status: curiosity. In a similar vein, maybe we could incorporate activities that get boys to develop their listening and mirroring skills, which is a positive step towards helping them develop empathy. Last, we could model an educational vocabulary for boys in small ways every day, like saying to a boy who clearly looks stung from a classmate's put down, "Man, I know I'd feel pretty hurt if someone said that to me." This normalizes emotions, teaches them not to fear them. That said, learning to model a more emotionally intelligent vocabulary for our boys wouldn't just heal them. It would start to heal many of our relationships too. Make no mistake, this is a messy affair, definitely uncomfortable and absolutely awkward at times. But that's what all relationships are, really, and that's the way they're supposed to be. And that's the first step, I think, to learning how to reach our boys. By rolling up our proverbial sleeves and getting the boys to learn how to talk with us, with each other, and especially with themselves. Thank you so very much for your time and your attention this morning.